Hello, I'm Venus with Galaxy Ink. And for this week's writing tips, we are on the 11th week of our Elements of Writing series, so we're almost done. And this week we're going to be talking about interviews, research, and expert opinions. So last week we talked a little bit about nonfiction, when we were talking about our personal narratives. So I thought this week we just kind of focus mostly on nonfiction and talk a little bit about some of those essentials that you need, besides everything else that we talked about, hooks and style and tone and all of that. So one of the very important things that I think is important to have in a nonfiction book is interviews. And interviews are hard because you have to put yourself out there and you have to call people who you might look up to, people that you really think are amazing and experts in their field, and you're like, oh my God, I have to call them or email them, or how do I even get their phone numbers? Like, I don't know. One, don't be shy. You're writing a book, you need this information. Think of yourself as a journalist if you want, but whatever it is, you have something you need to say, you've got some opinions, some ideas, and you need to interview some people. You need to have some of these experts, in your book. So, when you're determining who to interview, first you have to identify a couple of things. So one, what point are you trying to make? And will your interviewee be on board with that? And that's very important because whoever you're interviewing, they're not going to be okay with you writing a book where you cast them in a bad light. Right? So you need to make sure that they're okay with that. I used to work for a publisher. We had an author who had a person on the cover of the book and also didn't talk so great about them in the book. And that person came forward and said, I don't want my name on the cover or my picture on the cover of that book because you said something bad about me. And so we had to completely change the cover of the book. Not cool. And if the author had really thought ahead, maybe they would have thought about it a little bit more. Now that person wasn't interviewed, but they did give permission to use their picture, so maybe don't talk bad about the people that you put on the cover of your book. So first thing you have to identify are the people that what is the point that I'm trying to make, and would this person that I'm going to interview be on board with that? All right, so then you need to be clear about your goals for your book. And you need to be clear because you need to tell the person you're going to interview what your book's going to be about. You need to make sure that they know up front what point it is, what your big idea is, what you're hoping the book will accomplish, because if they're going to agree to it, they need to know ahead of time what's going to happen with this book. Might have to offer to give them a free copy of the book or something like that. And then I want you to identify 10 people in the field that you're looking at, and who you think that would add to the conversation, right? And be realistic. I think that there should always be that one person that you're like, there's no way I'm gonna get an interview with this person, but I'm gonna try anyways. I really do want to interview Bill Gates for my book about tech, and I might not be able to get a hold of him, but I'm gonna try. And that's why I said to be brave, don't be shy, try. You don't know, you might get that interview. But be more realistic about some of the people, within your sphere that you think will add to the conversation. So identify 10 people, write them down, say, all right, I'm going to write a book about, video game industry and how difficult it is. And then make a list of 10, independent gaming producers that you think that you would be able to contact, or maybe have made some of your favorite games, and see if you can't get interviews with them. Now, you might not get an interview with all 10 of them. You might only get 2 or 3, but that's more than you had before. So you got to start somewhere, right? Again, I will point out that you should not vilify your people unless you want a lawsuit. It's one thing to kind of be like, oh, this was maybe not a smart business decision, but you got to be really careful. That's skating on some thin ice with with lawsuits. And there have been books that have gotten lawsuits because somebody felt like their character had been misrepresented. They think that the book shouldn't even be published because of the things that were said about them in the book. So you got to be really careful, and be warned that if you're self-publishing, that is a minefield. Because what a traditional publisher would do is help navigate some of that legal route for you, where if you're doing it yourself, You don't know that, and so you've got to be really careful, okay? Be really careful. Then you need to prepare your interview questions in advance. Make sure that you have kind of a set standard of questions that you would like to ask, you know, each of these people, and then be open to different types of interviews. You might not be able to get an in-person interview. I know this past year getting an in-person interview would have probably been impossible. So you might have had to resort to a Zoom chat or some kind of web call, emails, in-person, casual, professional. Be prepared. I know I've read articles before where the interviewer is like, they asked me to come to their house and we're lounging in their living room, and it felt very odd because it felt so casual, and they're used to doing interviews at like a restaurant or something, you know, and that's all really interesting facts, but you know, obviously had to be open to interview this person wherever they could. Also probably need to be a little realistic there, where, you know, if you can't fly out to Seattle to meet Bill Gates and that's where he's at, then you're probably not going to be able to do that interview. And if he's like, I only do in-person interviews, you'd be like, oh, you know, another time then, I guess, because I can't afford to fly to Seattle. And then make sure that you ask at the end of the interview or at the end of your questions, if you've like emailed or something, if they'd be open to additional questions or clarifications. Some people, they're willing to answer your 10 questions, but that's it. They don't really want to have contact with you again. As long as you don't write anything terrible about them, they're okay. Some people are like, I want you to send me a copy of the book before you even publish it because I need to make sure that you don't misrepresent me. And some people are like, oh yeah, absolutely, hit me up again if you have more questions. This one's a tough one if you are doing like you're writing a story about your family, right? And so maybe you're interviewing your aunts and your uncles and your cousins and your grandmother, and family has a hard time sometimes understanding, you know, like what you're doing, especially if they're not writers. They'll be like, why are you interviewing me? Like, what about my life is that interesting? And to you, you know, the person writing the book, you're like, well, you have all these stories that you can tell me. I would love to know about, like, how did you marry this person? How did you meet this person? You know, what did you feel about grandma when you were little? You know, but to them, it just feels like intrusiveness. So you've got to be really careful and kind of walk this fine line with interviews where you're asking the right and appropriate questions, and if you would need to come back and ask them more, make sure that they're okay with that before you do it, even if it's your family, you know, and especially if you're asking kind of really heavy hitting topics that might feel more intrusive, make sure that your interviewees are prepared for that, and that you might actually need to do several interviews with them because of so much information you need to garner. So who should you avoid when you're looking for interviewees though? Because you might have your top 10 lists, but there's some things that, you know, as you start to email people and stuff, you might go, oh, maybe this is not the person I thought I should interview, or this person's not as professional as I thought they were. So the first one I would call the ghost. And that is the person who just doesn't respond to your emails. Or, you know, they responded the first time, but now they can't be bothered to reply. Make sure you're setting clear dates. So like, hey, I need this by this time. You know, expectations like, hey, you know, I'm planning on writing that chapter by, you know, December 20th. Can you please make sure that you have that information for me before then? Set that up. But if they don't send it and they don't reply to you after you've sent like a follow-up, like, hey, I was just wondering, you know, what the status is of those questions, don't just chase them, all right? Like, it is exhausting. That person is clearly not interested anymore, or they're ghosting you, and you just move on to the next person in your list, okay? Don't spend a lot of time chasing people that don't want to be interviewed. It's a little different if you have trouble getting a hold of people because they're out of the country or something like that, but you know, if they're not responding, don't just keep, you know, harping over and over again. Also avoid, and I don't want to say don't interview millionaires, but be careful of the millionaires. I've kind of already talked about this. You might not be able to get an interview with Bill Gates, even though you really want to, and you might add a lot to the conversation. But he's notoriously difficult to get an interview with. And he's gotten so high up that, you know, the interviews he does is for the New York Times and Fortune 500, not for, you know, somebody who's writing a book who's just out of college. You know, and so you got to be kind of realistic about that, and be understanding, use your connections if you have them, but like, don't expect that the millionaire is going to be the person who's going to respond to your calls, you know, if you can even find them. I mean, they're really different. And then there's also the reluctant interviewee. Don't bully people into granting you interviews, you know, or being like, well, you owe me a favor, so you better, you know, let me interview you. If people don't want to do it, they don't want to do it, and that's fine. You know, there's plenty of other people who are also experts in some of these fields who you can interview instead. So don't just go chasing other people. The only caveat to that, of course, is family. When we have difficulty getting a hold of family or talking to family, you know, if somebody doesn't want to be interviewed for your book, then you just have to deal with it. If Aunt Sue does not want to be a part of your book, then don't put Aunt Sue in your book. She's clearly made it clear that she doesn't want to be in there. It'd be the same as somebody saying, I don't want you to post my pictures online. Don't post their pictures online. Okay? Very simple. So then we got research. And research is separate from interviews, right? Because interviews are specific people. Research is looking for information that's outside of your very basic knowledge, right? I'm not even going to talk about Wikipedia. We're just going to leave it alone. Wikipedia can have decent sources, but you better be clicking on the sources. I think the thing that I have noticed a lot lately in nonfiction books that I've been editing has been a lack of variety. So it's like just tons of websites, and I get it. Everything's at the tip of our fingers, you know, websites, but you do need more than just a bunch of websites, especially if you're doing the research. We need books, journals, research papers. Double check that all your sources are actually accurate. Make sure that they're peer reviewed. Is this a paper, a scientific journal paper that was rejected and because it doesn't pass the peer review test? Or is it in an actual science journal? You know, and you cite the journal, not the I mean, you do cite the JSTOR website that you got it from, but like, make sure you're getting this information and then varying your sources so it's not all website. I know my kids, when they do research for papers, it's just all websites, and the teachers are fine with that. But when I'm reading a book, I expect you to have read books too. You're a writer and you're writing a book on this topic. I expect you to actually have looked up some of these sources and have actually read these books. And you're not just pulling a quote off of a website. You actually went to the library and checked out some of these books to make sure that you're not misquoting and that you're not taking things out of context. Then perform your own research. Send out a survey. Ask your friends and family questions. Contact a local school and see if they'll allow you to do a simple research study with kids. And I say that because I did that for my critical thesis. I talked about this in a previous video about disabilities. I did my critical thesis on disabilities in children's literature for young adults in middle grade. And in that thesis, one of the questions that came up as I was writing was, do kids care about the diagnosis in a book? If they were to read a book, you know, where the character's diagnosis is not listed, does that matter to them? And so I took 2 books that did not have a diagnosis label in them, which is Marcello in the Real World and Rules. There's a character, Jason, in Rules that no diagnosis is listed, and Marcello in the Real World, he doesn't actually have a diagnosis. And I took it to readers at a middle school and then young adult, because one was a middle grade, one's a young adult book, and then have them read it. And I had 3 different classrooms read it for each book. And then I had a little survey, and I even came in person and I asked the kids if they knew and if it mattered to them whether these characters, so we talked about the theme of the book, we talked about what the characters were like, we kind of dissected it a little bit, and then one of the big questions was, did you need to know the diagnosis of Jason in Rules? And did you need to know the diagnosis for Marcello? And the answer was a clear no. Like, there wasn't a single student who was like, yeah, I was really wanted to know, it was driving me nuts. Like, all of them were like, yeah, it doesn't really matter. Which, you know, was interesting because it kind of drove me nuts that I wanted a diagnosis. But the kids don't care. And that was the takeaway in this kind of study and survey that I did. So I did my own research. And that's what I encourage you to do. If you're writing these nonfiction books and you have a question you need answers to, ask people around you. If you're writing a self-help book about dating, ask your friends and family about their experiences with dating. You'll probably get some good sound bites, you'll get some good quotes, and you'll get some good information to kind of go off of. Then you need to find information that actually backs up your point, but do not cherry pick. Only pick information that pushes your point in an article. When an article has more nuance than that, you need to find information. So a good example, and I wrote it down here so I don't forget it. So this is what you write. You write it in your book. You say, a new study that interviewed 300 scientists and 99% of them are in agreement that fact A is true, with only a small percentage disagreeing of not having an opinion. And then you write, a recent study found that there is plenty of scientists who disagree with the consensus on fact A. Well, that's not true. I mean, plenty is 1% and the consensus is 99%. So you are not only cherry picking, but you're kind of twisting that fact so that it doesn't meet the criteria. And I think that anybody who reads your book and follows up and looks at that fact or looks at that article that you're citing will see that, and you'll get called out on it pretty quickly. So make sure that you're actually presenting the information as it is. And if you can't find information to back up your point, then your point might not be valid. Just saying. And then we have expert opinions, okay? And you're probably thinking, well, I had my interview and I've got all this research, that's expert opinions. True, but we also have experts out there who we're not going to be able to interview them, or we don't need to. They've already done interviews. They've already had that information, those sound bites that, you know, they've done interviews for magazines, they've done a TED Talk. So all you need to do is go find those people and include that information in there. Find those articles, those TED Talks, those books that they've written, and include their information in yours to help back up your point. And then you've got, you know, between interviews, your own research, you know, performing your own research and looking up research, and then their expert opinions, you'll have this well-rounded book. And then you include your big idea in there, and that helps form this book that has facts. And that's really what this is about. Interviews, research, expert opinions is facts to back up the information that you're presenting and you're putting forward, while making it accurate and not hopefully making anybody angry and creating a lawsuit. So don't forget to press like and subscribe to my channel. I post new writing tips almost every Friday. If you think you're ready to hire an editor, you can check me out at galaxy-inc.com. I've been Venus with Galaxy Inc. I hope your writing is out of this world.